I want you to imagine somebody gives you something. It's like an investment that, depending on how wise you are with it, would grow in value and actually become one of the more valuable things, indeed the most valuable thing that you would have, far above any exotic car or beautiful multi-room mansion with a beautiful view, better than any great collection of art or historical items or memorabilia, something that would be greater than vast fortunes or even a great job title that has a lot of prestige. Something that can be given to you that nurtured properly would very likely have great financial as well as non-financial value. And what is interesting is that everyone has this, from the youngest, from one like Grider that is young. See, he was with me. He was with me. As young as Grider, that has this, and I think already has some worth to it. To somebody like Brother Steve, Brother Derek, Frankie, and others that have this, and because they've been able to invest for longer, it is a very great value, especially by those who know value. And it's a very simple thing that everyone gets. There's two in the audience to whom I have given this, and one from whom I received it. And that is a name. A name. Something so simple as a name. A name is important because it represents something. It is more than just a collection of letters placed together, but rather when we hear that name or we read that name, or if I displayed that name, it would summon to mind, as if by magic, almost like a spell, calling something into our mind, an idea of something, or perhaps someone that we associate with that name. And it might be, depending on the word that I put to the name of an object, that because of our experience, that we might see something differently. If I said a school desk, I would imagine that perhaps something would come into mind. I had a few different types in school. Maybe some who have been homeschooled would think more of like the kitchen table, or maybe a work area that they have at home. Maybe someone who spent a lot of time in college would think of a very nice desk in an upper division or doctorate level program, maybe even a laboratory if that was the type of study that they did. But the name calls to mind something. It brings something together, something that we associate with that. We think about a name, it's really, in some ways, it's a title. It's a way to distinguish ourselves from one another. And yet, our name is something that becomes associated with the concept and ultimately even a reputation. Parents often think long and hard about what name to give their children. Cindy is often fond of telling about when we named our children, that one of my first exercises when she was doing the name is I would go through of how would I insult this child in school using this name. And there were a few that were just, I mean, they didn't even stick on the plate before they were gone. It's like, no, I would have a field day with that in school. And then some names that maybe our experience, that we like the sound of this name, but it's like, based on our experience, no, that calls to mind somebody that I don't want to have called to mind on a regular basis. And so that is a concern. Parents, again, often think long and hard about that. The last name, the surname, belongs to the family collectively. And it's a family responsibility to ensure that on the whole, that name is associated with a good reputation or whatever reputation you want to have. Maybe you want that name to be associated with roughness and don't mess with us because we will be violent. I wouldn't urge that, but there are some people that is the way that they want you to hear their name. Not think about it with fondness, but with fear. But most people want that last name to mean something, despite a few exceptions that have that family name. But we want that reputation. And so, there are some family names that are associated with trouble, with uselessness, a burden on the community, despite a few who have that last name that do not exhibit that have broken perhaps a cycle of dysfunctional living. Some family names are associated with kindness and generosity and helpfulness and faithfulness, even despite a few within that family who wear that name who might go against the grain. And obviously we saw a lot of that this weekend with the Hancock name. And I can remember growing up, Mom counseling about my behavior when I was in high school. It's a reflection on her, and it's a reflection on our name. It's, and I've done that with my children. That really the biggest thing is what you're standing before God, but also we all bear this name, and so there is a bit of responsibility to the family to behave in a way that is honorable. Parents will often choose a first, and if they give a middle name or even other names, based on other family members, people who were dear to them, people they admired, and a name perhaps to live up to, that they gave a name that meant something great because they expected that child to have high ambitions or to be known for good service. A good name has always been a valued possession in the eyes of God and men, because a good name, often when you have those words together, it gets to that idea of the reputation. What does that name call to mind when I think about this person? In the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 7, Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 1, the writer of Ecclesiastes, out of the wisdom, and remember, the first couple of chapters talk about the great wealth that he had. And vanity of vanities, all is vanity. It ultimately didn't bring value. But notice what he says. This is one of the many better passages in Ecclesiastes, that having this is better than this. Doesn't necessarily mean the second thing's worse, but it's an emphasis on the higher value of something. He says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. And this was a passage that Sam referenced yesterday. This is a hard one, I think, for us to really grasp, because if I went to probably most everybody's bathroom, and I promise I'm not going to do that, but if I did, I'd probably find a lot of ointments and perfumes. And I can tell you in the Davis kitchen, well, actually we do have them in the kitchen, as a matter of fact. But in the bathroom, there are two sinks, my wife's sink and mine, that my daughters intrude on Sunday mornings too. But this is an ointment perfume heavy side of the bathroom. There are representatives here. And we probably have different things to make the house smell nice. Maybe have those little things that you plug in, different candles. So So the idea of a perfume or an ointment to us is something that's very common. But for the audience to which the book of Ecclesiastes addresses, a precious ointment was something that was very valuable. It was hard to get, hard to make, and so it would be a luxury item as opposed to just something that is very common. And so for these ancients to have this luxury item, something that is valuable, that would have had, and you go to museums and you will find very nice pottery and other type of containers that were just for ointment, because it was such a valuable thing. You wanted in something that also was valuable. It was pleasing to the senses. And the precious ointment might make us superficially pleasing, but a good name is something that reflects an inward beauty that is evidenced by how we live our life. The ointment, the odor will fade. It will have to be replaced. But a good name is better, because that is something that does not need to be replenished. That is something that just grows when we live in a way that gives it that value. So a good name, not just a name, a good name, a good reputation is better than precious ointment. In Proverbs chapter 22 in verse 1, we go up the value scale. So precious ointment, a luxury item in that time. Now look at Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 1. A good name, think there, a reputation that is associated with your name. A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver and gold. So if you had to choose, it's like you could have a sterling reputation, a great reputation, that when people hear your name, they immediately have high, noble thoughts. They think good things because they associate that with your name, or it can give you a bunch of riches. There are a lot of people in this world in our day who will say, give me the riches. I don't care. But the good name is better than that. In fact, it's that good name that is often what will sustain us better than riches will. Because if you have a good name that's built from a good reputation of godly living, you don't worry about being destitute. People will try to help a person who has such a reputation. They will go out of their way to help and assist someone. It will be, a good name is a better security. A good name is so important, he says here, that if someone wanted to offer you great riches so that all your needs, every desire that you have would be met, you would be immediately insulted that they gave you such a low offer that you would reject it. Do you recognize your name has that kind of value, that if they offered you all this wealth, that you would go, what are you trying to rip me off? You know, that I wouldn't even consider that kind of money. After the war between states, Robert E. Lee was offered $50,000 for the use of his name for, I think it was a whiskey. It was a sales product. Some marketer offered it. His reply was simple, and this is interesting because it was a difficult thing during the war and the aftermath. His house that's in Virginia was taken and seized. In fact, Arlington, one of the most honorable cemeteries, in some ways was a bit of a stick to Robert E. Lee, that they had taken his home and then they turned his property into a national cemetery, that he's not getting this back. And yet it's one of those things that the more you know about him, you realize what really ultimately that became an honor for him. But his home had been seized. his a lot of things that he had was taken. His material possessions refused, so he was offered this $50,000, which in our money today is probably about $1 million, if not more, to use his name for the marketing of a product. His reply was, "Sir, my name is my heritage from my parents. It's all I have, and it's not for sale." That's how valuable we need to see our name and how much we would want to guard it. In Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 7, Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 7. Notice the contrast that he makes here. The memory of the righteous is a blessing. The memory of it itself is a blessing. But the name of the wicked will rot, or is rottenness in some cases. Again, we think to yesterday, we think about Ed that we've been mentioning, and others in the last few years. We gather, we honor their memory, but truly godly, we think about the lasting legacy of godliness, humility, and service that was aroused when somebody mentions that name. I tell you, one of the better to go in the house of mourning than the house of feasting. One of the things that really hit me a bunch of years ago, that especially when I went to the funerals of people who had been very successful in business and had excelled in whatever industry they were in. I went to a funeral, in fact, participated in the funeral of a man who had several patents to his name, who had a PhD, great reputation for his academic achievements, and I've been to a few of those. And yet, you know what people talked about at the funeral? And talked about in the visitation? You remember that time when, and then they talk about something that befell, bad that happened to them. And he or she was just right there and did such and such for me. It wasn't about the PhD. It wasn't about any kind of success or patents or anything else. The legacy is in the godliness, in the little things, the little actions. They were always this kind of person. A name associated with service. But the name of the wicked, notice it says the name of the wicked will rot. The name of the wicked, those who have taken instead of giving, those who have hurt instead of healed, those who have destroyed instead of building. Their names have been associated with their witness. Hitler, Judas, Jezebel, Ahab, Cain, Balaam, Mussolini. There's a whole lot of names that will not be found in the baby book, because that name has rotted. How they have lived under the banner of that name has been such that nobody would want to name their child that. I would not want them to even be associated with that. Brethren, it's just a collection of letters put together. But the name Jezebel means something. And it's not something, it's something we want to distance ourselves from. That name has rotted. The successful investor Warren Buffett, in a quote that really has its origins more with Benjamin Franklin, said, "It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it." If you think about that, you'll do things differently. And I encourage especially the young people to really dwell on that. Benjamin Franklin didn't put a time period on it, but that same idea that you could spend and invest so much of your life in building a good reputation, and then you can run the damage of it by doing something so foolish without thinking. In 1 Samuel chapter 11, Samuel was the last of the judges. And if you remember, the people wanted a king. They wanted a king to be like the nations round about them. God had already envisioned the idea of a future king, because we find some things in the law that talk about the regulation of kings. But I think the intent was always that would come on God's time. And here the people were pushing it. They were pushing it for the wrong reason. We want a king to be like the nations go around us. We want to have somebody who goes before us in battle. All their reasons were earthly. And God had done all those things for them in the past. And there was no indication that he was giving up that position. But they wanted to be like the nations around about them. And so they basically said to Samuel, they also brought his kids into it, said, look, your kids don't really, don't exemplify the things that we're looking for. So we want you to appoint a king. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 11 and verse 14, all the people went to Gilgal. They made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. They sacrificed peace offerings for the Lord. And there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. And Samuel said, chapter 12, verse 1, Samuel said to all of Israel, behold, I have obeyed your voice in all that you have said to me, and have made a king over you. Now, behold, the king walks before you, and I am old and gray, and behold, my sons are with you. I have walked before you from my youth until this day. So he said, first thing I want to throw into evidence, because I'm asking you to put me on trial. This is a very bold thing for Samuel to say. I'm asking you to put me on trial. First of all, I've lived with you from my youth to this day, to the time he was dedicated into God's service until this point. He says, I'm old and gray, so I've got a lot of evidence for you to consider. Here I am. Testify against me before the Lord and before his anointed himself and the king. Whose ox have I taken? Or whose donkey have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? Testify against me, and I will restore it to you. In my position as your judge, testify if I have taken a bribe, if I have used my position to enrich myself. If I have done any of these things, testify it today. And they said, you have not defrauded us or oppressed us or taken anything from any man's hand. And he said to them, the Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day that you have not found anything in my hand. And they said, he is witness. And then he went on and gave them exhortation from that. What a bold thing to be able to say. The only way he could have the boldness to say that was to know that he had been fair in all of his dealings, that he did not use his position to enrich himself. He did not use his position to thwart judgment, that he had been fair to the mission that God had given him. We come to the New Testament, Acts chapter 16. We go from an old man to a young man. In Acts chapter 16, verses 1 through 2, Paul was in the habit of accumulating people to mentor and to train in the work of spreading the gospel, knowing that he was not going to be always able to do this. In Acts chapter 16 and verse 1, Paul came to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. And I think the implication there is he was not a believer. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. And Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they knew that his father was a Greek. And we know from our Bible study of how Timothy progressed and even some of the trials that he went through, but his continued growth. But notice, it's not just his reputation was in that one city. Lystra and Iconium. Before Paul got there, I was like, oh, Timothy, I want to be there. I want to go travel with Paul. I want to go do all this stuff. So I need to do a couple of good things. No, Timothy had already built that reputation, and Paul wanted him to accompany because of what he had already become, not what he expected Timothy to do. He was going to build on a good foundation. Timothy was a very young man, and yet he already had a great example and a great reputation among the believers in a couple of cities in that area. As I said at the beginning, our surname is our family name. We wear the name of our family: Davis, Hancock, Hughes, Eskowitz, Denniston, other names. But as Christians, we wear a name that is above that. We wear the name of Christ. Christ is our family name. When we talk about being Christian, Christian means I am of Christ. A person who is of Christ. And so our lives must live up to that name. Thinking back to Timothy, but this time in Paul's letter to Timothy, in 1 Timothy chapter 4, in verse 12, this was a passage that I was introduced to when I was a very young man. Remember, I'm sure I heard it since elementary school, but it really seemed to resonate in middle school and high school. That Paul writes, "Let no one despise you for your youth." Some translations say, "Don't let anyone look down upon you for your youth." Now, some young people will kind of take that and say, "Yeah, don't look down on me. I'm just as good as everybody else." Is that what Paul's saying? Well, in some ways, but not for the reason that we might think. See, some people will say, I don't want you to look down on me because I'm young. I want you to hear what I have to say because of their pride. Here he says, don't let anyone look down on you or despise you. That is to devalue you because you are young. But set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. How do you have somebody not look down upon you because you're young? Because they look up to how you live. That they see the way you talk, the way you act, the way you show love towards other people, your kindness, your purity, the kind of choices that you make in entertainment, and who you're with, how you carry yourself, how you trust God. There's not an older person in here that does not love to see that in a young person and does not respect that in a young person. I say this especially the young people. Your parents, teachers, members of the church, other good men and women will not look down on you when you live a dignified life, when you live a name that brings honor to the name of Christ, that you show a pure, honest, faithful life, not a perfect life. Nobody's expecting perfection. Nobody's expecting perfection from those who are younger or from those of us who are older, but to see a life that wants to let Christ's light be reflected in it. Philippians 2 talks about us shining as lights in the world, having that mind of Christ in us, evident in how we live. Martin's been teaching in 1 Peter, we talk about 1 Peter chapter 2, that we should live such a way that when the evildoers defame our name or denigrate our name, that when they examine all the evidence, that they're ashamed that they ever said anything. So that's one thing we have to be mindful, that we can be living a good life. We can be living a righteous life. And there are some people that will still think ill of us. There are some people who will think ill of us precisely because we're following Christ. There will also be some who they make snack judgments about us and they don't think highly of us. I think when you look about the idea of, like, for example, the elders of being of good reputation, that does not mean there's not one person walking this earth that thinks anything bad about them. I don't think you could say that about anybody. I think we've all had examples of people, and I've known of examples of people that no matter how much you've given, how much you've tried, how much you've encouraged, all you've done things, they find something that they don't like and they hold on to it, and other people bless and praise things that a person may do, and this person will just go, oh yeah, but they did such and such one time. And that will never be cleared from their mind. When I talk about a good name and a good reputation, it's by people who know value. Because you can have something that's very valuable, and somebody who doesn't know value, they'll sell it cheaply because they don't know what it's worth. And so there are always going to be people who are going to take something, or they're going to hold on to something, and I just don't. If you can't really estimate the value of what's good and what's right, I don't really care the value that you placed on my life. If you're an ungodly, wicked person, and you think that following Jesus is dumb and trying to live a godly life is just foolish, and therefore I know you don't know how to estimate value. And so I'm not concerned about your estimate of my name. But our enemies should be centered that if somebody were to call and say, well, what do you mean by that? And then all of a sudden ask them to call more evidence, and then they started presenting a lot of evidence to the contrary, that they would be ashamed. If they are honest in their judgment, they would be ashamed that they have drawn such a conclusion. Philippians 1 and verse 27 says to live worthy of the gospel. Our calling demands holiness because we wear the name of Christ. And we don't want to live in ways that take away from that. But, so quickly, our name can be worthless. People can buy security systems and safes, hire guards to protect their silver and their gold. Our reputation is more value. Therefore, it needs to be protected with all diligence. But the fact is, sometimes despite our best effort, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to we're going to do things that devalue that. Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 1, a damaged reputation is like putrid perfume. It's like fly in the perfumer's ointment. All right, let's go to that. Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 1. So 7 verse 1 tells us that it's like a good name's like precious ointment. 10 and verse 1, dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. And so we can live in a way that damages that. It is sad when you see somebody who's known for a dignified and holy life that allows themselves to indulge in unrighteousness, to have that soiled. I think we've all heard of preachers and elders and other Christians who have done much for the kingdom, falling to foolish temptations and damaging their reputations beyond repair. And I'll say this. It may be that there's times that we go through, maybe in our youth, maybe at different times where we're not living the way that we ought to. There's two ways to approach that in your life. One of them is to say, well, I've already damaged it, and so there's no use in doing anything beyond that. And you just continue living, making foolish decisions, doing foolish things, and because you say, oh, okay, well, I've done this. This is what people associate with me, or this is, I've got this associated with me, and so there's no use even trying. I think that's a very poor way to approach it. If you're damaged, don't give up and give in to evil. The simple thing is start rebuilding. Start rebuilding. It may take your whole life. It may take, surprisingly, much less time than that. We should never give up trying if we find ourselves in this position. I have known of too many people in my life who have gone through a period of life where they have made foolish decisions, but the wise decisions they made after that far, far eclipsed that period of foolishness. So much that that period became the aberration in their life. It did not become the characteristic of their life. God be praised that He gives us a second chance, that He is forgiving, and that we can build back a good reputation. 2 Peter chapter 3 tells us that we need to live good lives in anticipation of judgment. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 17 tells us that we will be judged for our behavior. Ultimately, our name will be praised or cursed in judgment. Final passage I want to go to in Revelation chapter 20 and verse 11. The name that has been given to us at birth, the name that was bestowed upon us, whether you were named after a relative, whether you were named after somebody that your parents admired, whether it was just, hey, this name sounds good, I like that. Or whether you were named after a nurse in a hospital, like Mom. That name we use throughout our life will have one final time where it is the most significant. And how we live our lives, for those who were at the service yesterday, how we live in the dash, how we live determines that last most important use of our name. Revelation chapter 20 and verse 11, I saw the great white throne, Him who is seated on it. From His presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were open. And I get the idea that this is the word of God that's open. Then another book open, which is the book of life. The dead were judged by what was written in the book according to what they had done, how they had lived. The sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death of lake of fire. If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. I don't care if my name ever makes it into a history book, in a record book, or anything else that's characterized with this world. I do strive to live that my name is in the Lamb's book of life, so that I could hear, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your Lord at the judgment. Not because I've been a great guy, but because Jesus has been great. Not because I come up with these great things to do, but Jesus has demonstrated through his example and through his teachings, this is what you ought to be doing. This is how you ought to be living. If you're not a child of God, I hope that you would take one more name besides the names that your parents gave you and the one that you inherited by being part of that family. That's the name of Christ. And you put on the name of Christ through baptism. And if you're a child of God, honor that name. Live up to that name. And when you sin, you go to the Father through that name of Christ. And you ask forgiveness and you ask strength to help you to build up and rebuild so that you may honor him. Our God is a forgiving God. We can help in any way. Please come while we stand.